Welcome everyone. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about what is going on with the NYPD, the largest police department in the entire world. The most data-driven police department in our country is struggling to maintain staffing levels, and this is due in large part to officers retiring at a clip of 200 cops per month, and the complete and utter deficit in recruiting that they're facing, which is not only short-staffing the NYPD, but the people who are making the cut are just worse candidates in comparison to previous generations of NYPD officers. But before we get into that, I want to say thank you to everybody who signed up over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
And thank you to the podcast listeners, Spotify, Apple, and Google's podcasting platform.
We have a staffing crisis going on in the NYPD right now. Our members are overworked, understaffed, not being able to get days off, barely being able to get meals.
So I just want to say something that not a lot of people will tell you when they're covering a story like this, and that is that Patrick Henry is a representative of the NYPD, so you gotta take what he says with a bit of a grain of salt. And the reason why is because his organization's sole purpose is to recruit more officers to grow their union, get them more days off and higher pay, so he's incentivized to exaggerate every single problem that we have and not tell you how what his organization is doing is actually contributing to the issues. But one of the things I like about this CBS segment is they actually interview a more neutral expert that tells you how not only the Black Lives Matter riots have contributed to this problem and in a big way, and that's mostly on the recruiting side, but how the way that the NYPD contracts are negotiated by the union actually set the police department up for failure if there was ever a shock to the system, a shock to police morale, like we saw in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter riots.
We see the NYPD is having trouble keeping officers and recruiting them. Why would you say interest is so low right now?
You know, Mary, that's a really good question. I mean, policing is what ought to be seen as a relatively attractive job. You get a chance to do work for the public good. You're paid pretty well. So why are people not signing up?
So right here, they bring in their own law enforcement expert, and he makes the case for why the police is a good job. The pay's pretty good. The benefits are absolutely fantastic. Obviously, you got the pension, the healthcare, and all that. And it is work that should be and is normally and has been throughout American history at different points in time seen as noble work. And yet there is a gulf in new recruits. And the reason for that is because perception has changed in the police in this country, and that is due in large part to the George Floyd effect, due in large part to the Black Lives Matter riots, and due in large part to the fact that cutting funding from the police department is a go-to move for a lot of these left-wing politicians.
The real elephant in the room is public perception. There's a gulf between what the police do and what people think they do. So that is the real issue right now. After George Floyd, after stop and frisk, after all the attention to the abuses by what ultimately is a small number of police officers.
And as I've said before on this channel multiple times, when you cut the budget of the police, there are consequences of that. When officers leave the force, even if you restore funding later, you don't magically materialize those officers. One of the things that we're seeing, not only with the NYPD, but with the DC Police Department, the LAPD, is that they offer all of these incentives for new recruits. And the reason they need to do that is because you have to give big financial rewards to people who will sign up because you've driven down recruiting so much. So you could be spending more in your police department in current year, but that cut that you did a couple of years ago ends up having the consequences of making your dollars go less far.
The real elephant in the room is public perception.
Look, I can't disagree with this. The number one issue that police departments are facing is not police brutality, it's not racism, it's perception. The idea that people think that they're evil white racists, that they're brutalizing people for no reason all over the country. And a perfect example of this is the George Floyd incident. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say George Floyd died of a fentanyl overdose. We've actually covered that. I was one of the first people to bring up that as a possibility and explain why I thought that the defense was going to go with that in that particular case. But let's set that aside for a second and realize how irrational the response was to the George Floyd incident, no matter what you believe the cause of death ultimately was. Because the knee on the neck, that level of restraint or that type of restraint, has been banned by the NYPD since 1993. Officers cannot use neck restraint if they work for the New York Police Department. And yet, that particular incident resulted in a funding cut of the NYPD, of the LAPD, of all these different departments across the country, whether they were working well or not. One of the most tragic incidents happened in Oakland, where they pulled money out of the police department, they lost a bunch of officers, and after seeing crime fall to the lowest levels in the history of the city of Oakland for 5 straight years, they then upticked back to the old pattern based on the fact that they defunded the police. It was a disaster in every possible way. But why should that be the case? Why do people perceive the NYPD as bad because of an incident out in Minnesota? Again, when that tactic specifically is banned by the NYPD and has been since 1993. We're talking 30 years of that tactic being banned, and yet it still resulted in a negative perception of the department. This is because of the media. This is because they wanted to make this about all of policing rather than the specific police department, or in reality, the specific officers related to that incident. They try to magnify problems like this in order to skew your perception, and guess what? It may not have worked for you guys out there in my audience, but it definitely worked for the general public.
There's a stay away. Something else Patrick Henry said to Marsha Kramer. The word of mouth, don't take this job.
This is also 100% true. Now, you guys might think I'm a bit skewed because I went to a criminal justice school in the city of New York, but in reality, I actually don't know that many cops, and I don't know or keep in contact with any cops from the university that I went to. I only know the people who joined the police department that I knew as children, and a lot of them will tell you the same thing. They're looking for another job. They're counting the days till their retirement. And again, they're 30. They've only been on the force for like 10 years, and they're still looking for that day that they can retire or go into another profession, because the changes, the culture, the morale, all of that is down, and they're warning new recruits off of joining this job because they don't think that the city is going to have their back. They don't think that even the cop mayor, Eric Adams, is going to have their back, and their work is constantly being undercut by the New York State legislature with things like bail reform that releases criminals immediately, and District Attorney Alvin Bragg for Manhattan, who refuses to prosecute anyone for anything. And even if you don't have a particularly woke district attorney like Alvin Bragg in Manhattan, there's all these other stories that we've covered on this channel of judges in the Bronx, judges in Queens, judges in Brooklyn, cutting breaks to criminals in order to let them out, even if the district attorney wants to prosecute that particular criminal. So it is a disastrous scenario for future recruits, and the officers that are in the midpoints of their career that should be invested in their job because they've been there for, half of their adult lives are telling people to stay away, get out of here. It's not worth it. Don't join. The bonus is a trap, and that is disastrous going forward.
Talk about the impact of the lack of officers. What does this mean for safety?
Well, the first thing it means is the officers that are on the job work more overtime. They are tired. They're under more stress, and that impacts on public safety because you're pushing people to the edge of their envelope.
I actually think that this problem is one of the most understated issues with police departments across this country, because not only does this affect police officer performance now, but when they do perform badly because they're overworked, because they're working 12-hour shifts to cover up for the fact that their staffing shortages, that's going to lead to more violent instances, more questionable instances, which will lead to more public backlash, which will lead to more calls to defund the police, which will lead to more officers leaving the force and more overtime. And over time, we're going to end up with an ever decreasing police department that is not only decreasing in terms of numbers, but is decreasing in terms of effectiveness and effectiveness per officer. I don't care how good good you are as a cop or at any job. If you're overworked, if you're not sleeping, your performance is going to suffer. And when that happens with the police, people end up getting injured, people end up getting killed, and there are broader political consequences for that.
You're losing cops from retirement at the rate that Patrick Henry said, over 200 a month. But you're also not recruiting cops at the rate we used to. So less people are taking the police exam, and the recruiting efforts really need to be stepped up even more.
Now, the fact that less people are taking the policing exam is disastrous, because what this ends up meaning is that you have a lower pool of people in order to choose from. And if you guys don't understand how this works, when you take the exam, you are up and eligible to be recruited by the NYPD for 4 years. And what ends up happening is they go to the top tier and they work their way down the list. But if you have less people, the top tier is significantly lower than in years past. So even though they're recruiting way less people because they're just not getting as many applications, the people they are recruiting are the worst officers. And guess what? The officer in your neighborhood, the ones that are assigned to foot patrol, those are usually the rookie officers. So you're getting more out of shape, less intelligent, did less on their tests kind of officers being pushed through the academy in order to stop the bleeding that is happening across the department. Again, and I'm not talking to those who are in favor of defunding the police or abolishing the police. Obviously, you guys are beyond saving. Is this a system that you think will produce good results if you're in favor of police reform, if you want there to be less violent instances, if you want there to be less questionable shootings? Because having worse officers out the gate and working them overtime to fill the gaps of those who aren't being recruited, again, sounds like an absolute disaster waiting to happen.
Crowds recently restored some cuts to the NYPD. What are some other things you think the city can do to retain officers?
Retaining after 20 years is very tricky. New York City officers are blessed with a pension that allows you to retire after 22 years. That's a rarity in other cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Diego. You have to stay till 50. So that's a challenge. What do you do to keep people who are eligible to retire to stay on the job?
So what I like about this guy is he told you something right there that the head of the PBD is never going to tell you. And the reason why is because they want that period where you could retire with full pension and benefits to be shorter rather than longer. But the thing is, there's actually no financial incentive for you to stay in the New York Police Department beyond those 22 years. You have to love being in the NYPD so much that you're willing to forego a second pension in order to stay with them beyond that point. What a lot of people do in New York City government is they'll become a cop, they'll do their 22 years, retire with full pension and benefits, and then they'll get another government job in the Department of Education or somewhere else, do 22 years there, and what ends up happening is by the time they're 65, they have 2 guaranteed pensions from the city of New York, and this is the phenomenon known as double dipping. This is a harsh incentive to fight against. So anything that's going to tip the scales of morality against being a police officer is going to push out officers in droves into these other career paths, because again, if you don't do this, you lose so much money, you have to be an absolute idiot. If I was advising any of the cops in and around 22 years of service on what they should do, should they stay on the force, try to rank up, or should they go get another government job, I would tell them 100% of the time as the best option for them to go get another government job and double dip, because New York City allows you to do that. I appreciate this guy being interviewed because he mentions it, and you know for a fact that the head of the police union is never going to mention this. He's never going to talk about this, because this is one of the greatest financial incentives, which by the way should drive recruiting to the NYPD, that you could possibly have, and taking that away would be a disservice to his union members.
When conditions of the kind of oversight that the city council has proposed, let's record every single interaction with the public. These kinds of things are wearing.
Now look, to be clear, I'm not against oversight, and I think that the police unions across this country have messed up from time to time. One of the biggest errors of the police unions was opposing body cameras. It turns out body cameras have helped way more cops, probably 1,000 to 1 ratio, than they've actually hurt, because the body cameras tend to produce evidence that the criminals that they engage with are in fact lying about abuses. Again, 1,000 times more likely than in situations where the cop is doing something wrong. So I think they made a mistake opposing that because that's helped officers more than anything in recent years. And there are definitely other types of proposed oversight that the police are overreacting to. However, what he mentioned right there about recording every single police interaction, that is not body cam recording of every police interaction. What the city council in New York is trying to do is get them to write a full report for every time they engage with a citizen on anything. So you talk to them, whatever. It goes beyond the normal checking of a box when they did a search, which was instituted after Mayor Bloomberg got into trouble with his stop and frisk program. And this is meant to bog down the officers, make the job less enjoyable, waste more time of the officers. And considering you have limited staffing right now, this drives people away from the profession and, of course, makes officers less effective. This would be an example of bad oversight, something that handcuffs the officers that produces no real good. You're just using them to collect data in order to call them racist in the future, rather than an effective oversight or an effective check on police abuse, like I believe the body cams have been. Now look, they said in this segment that Eric Adams had restored some of the funding that was cut from the NYPD, but like I said, that doesn't make officers materialize out of nowhere. That doesn't boost the morale of the NYPD. And also, he's proposed budget cuts that are going to significantly impact the NYPD for migrants, because we have all these people here illegally in this country that are in New York City that Eric Adams is trying to pay for. And what's he taking that out of? The NYPD budget. It's taken out of the budget across the board. It's a 5% cut, but that particular cut is particularly harsh for the NYPD because they were already in a recruitment crisis prior to it. So there are a lot of problems for the New York Police Department, and we've seen in New Orleans, when you start shedding officers at too rapid of a rate, crime goes up significantly, and this is a disastrous scenario, and it has been a disastrous scenario for that city, which has, on average, 2-hour response times, requires people to file police reports over the internet, and all sorts of other issues in a city that was already, to start with, much worse off than New York City, but it just goes to show you what the long-term trajectory of defunding the police actually is, and losing officers can actually have on your city. But I want to leave the question up to you guys out there in the audience. Do you think that this is much ado about nothing, that you can get rid of all the cops and everything will be a-okay first class all the way? Or are you a logical, rational person who can see where this is going? As usual, if you like this video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the NYPD hemorrhaging officers. Till next time.